Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Laub, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today, which is on HR compliance for restaurants. In today's webinar, you're going to get a very comprehensive overview of how to avoid many of the key, what I would call pitfalls and trouble points that can cause any business to get in trouble with almost an endless stream of employment law violations. And today we're joined by a very special guest, who is an expert in helping small businesses navigate this pretty complex area. But before introducing Danielle, I want to welcome my colleague, Joe Erickson. Joe, and thank you for being here on the webinar.
Hello, Jim. Thank you. And Danielle, great to be here with you today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Great. And let me tell folks a little bit about you. Danielle Verderosa, did I do okay?
Perfect.
Okay,
Perfect.
Great. Okay. Danielle is the founder and president of HR Allies, and HR Allies is a human resources advisory firm with independent, and her company serves independent restaurants and other small businesses nationwide. And what they do is they help to protect small businesses from human resource risk and liability. She has over 25 years of experience in the human resources area. She's worked for companies like Chipotle, and also several other companies in the hospitality industry. And Danielle, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jim, Joe. I really appreciate you asking me to be here today. I'm a big fan of restaurantowners.com and glad to be here. I've got my first human resources position in 1996. At Johnson & Wales University in Providence, Rhode Island. They hired me to work with the culinary and hospitality students to get them ready for graduation and their first jobs after school. And that's when I fell in love with the hospitality industry and everybody in it. And I've worked in human resources in hospitality ever since 1996. I am a wannabe chef and a wannabe restaurateur, but I also really like sitting on my in my chair and in an office all day. So that's why I'm lucky I found the human resources field. 2 years ago, I left my vice president of HR position to work for my own company, a company called HR Allies, and I'm glad to be able to talk with you all about human resources compliance, which is my very favorite topic in the whole world. I'm not an attorney. What I'm going to be talking about today isn't legal advice, but over the 25 years that I've worked in HR, I have seen a lot of problems that have happened because it's so easy to accidentally violate employment laws. And so for well-meaning owners and well-meaning operators to want to be doing the right thing, but they are ignorant about the law. And then what happens is all heck breaks loose and you wind up with an awful lot of drama and an awful lot of distraction that you don't need and financial costs that you certainly don't need. So that's why I enjoy helping restaurant owners with HR compliance. I'm not an attorney, but I am Italian American and I use my hands an awful lot while I talk. So I'm going to try to be on my best behavior today, but let me just point that out in advance in case you don't know if I'm aware of it. So the next 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about what is human resources compliance, why the restaurant industry is especially susceptible to it, and to the investigations and lawsuits from the Department of Labor. I'm going to tell you about the 2 areas of Department of Labor focus that you will really want to be aware of because, and it's just 2 areas, main areas, because they're the easy things to accidentally violate in the restaurant industry. And mostly I want to brief you about the different laws that restaurants can most easily violate so that you go from I don't know what I don't know to, okay, now I know what I may not know, and that way I can be at least aware of it. And then finally, I'm going to give you some practical tips, easy, inexpensive, proactive tips, not a lot of HR bells and whistles that you can use to protect your business from the Department of Labor and employee lawsuits. So first of all, what is human resources compliance? HR compliance is when you align your HR policies and your practices with the federal government's laws and regulations so that you are protected or avoiding fines and penalties for noncompliance. You are minimizing the opportunity for scandals and drama to hit your restaurant and the community if you're doing something that's illegal to the Department of Labor. And it also shows good faith efforts to recognize and adhere to the laws if you have human resources compliance. And finally, though there's not an actual tangible cost to this, when you've got strong human resources compliance, you are assuring your employees that they work for a reputable company. I don't know about you. When I was younger, I've worked for a couple of shady operators in my past, and maybe you know some, maybe you've worked for some before. When your HR compliance is on point, your employees know that you are a company with integrity and that legitimately wants to do the right thing by them and not take advantage of them. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be talking an awful lot about the Department of Labor, the federal government, U.S. Department of Labor. But at the top, I want to acknowledge that every single state and many cities and many counties across the United States, they have their own version of a Department of Labor. And if you are fortunate enough to operate in some states like Texas or one of the Carolinas, it's no big deal. Your states have the same laws generally have the same laws that the federal government has. But in other states like California, New York, Massachusetts, Washington State, your state's Department of Labor laws are going to be even more strict and onerous than what I'm talking about today. So though I'm talking about the federal government laws, please just be aware that your state has its own laws, and depending on where you are, they might be nuts. The Department of Labor, it used to be that we only had to worry really about a couple of things. We had to worry that we were hiring people that were eligible to work in the United States legally, and that we were paying them correctly, not in cash under the table, but through payroll and paying their overtime correctly. But in 2014, things kind of changed under President Obama. And that year, the Department of Labor went on the attack against restaurant industry. Purposely, proudly, they bragged about it. They announced that they were going to start escalating the enforcement of the laws in their laws in the restaurant industry, because they consider restaurant employees to be especially in need of protection, because there was, they believe, a high propensity of poor illegal treatment of restaurant workers by employers. So in 2014, they added a few thousand extra investigators and claims intake people, and they went to work looking into restaurant employment practices. And they've even bragged online. I just saw something when I was preparing for this presentation that they say they have found violations in nearly every single one of the 9,000 restaurants, full service restaurants, that they have investigated in the last few years. So this isn't something that we wonder if maybe they're targeting us. They are definitely targeting the restaurant industry. And I pulled this chart off of the Department of Labor website. They call it the low wage, high violation industries. And you can see there's food services. We are number one in the number of cases that were opened. And this is just in 2022, but their data goes back and we're at the top for years before that. We're number one in the number of cases. We're number one in the number of employees they have protected. And we are number two behind the construction industry in the back wages that they have recovered for employees. So again, they're looking at us very, very carefully. There's two areas specifically that I want to talk about today where the laws pertain to restaurant industry, that pertain to everybody, but it's unfortunately easy for us to violate all of these laws. The first main area are the wage and hour laws. The wage and hour laws are everything to do with how you pay employees for the hours that they worked. The minimum wage laws, overtime, record keeping, the employment of minors, the tip laws, and the laws that govern whether you are legally allowed to pay somebody a salary and exempt them from overtime, or if you have to pay them hourly and pay them overtime. Besides the wage and hour laws, also there's the equal employment opportunity laws. We're certainly familiar with those. They've been around since 1964, though they keep evolving. And those are the laws that talk about it being illegal to discriminate or treat anybody differently based on their protected characteristics, their race, sex, national origin, age, disability, etc. And again, not to put too fine a point on it, but the Department of Labor feels like they're championing the underdogs very well when it comes to investigating and fining or suing restaurant operators. They've got this newsroom on their website. I went on about a month ago or so and just typed in the word restaurant, and you can see up pops all of the times that the Department of Labor has sued a restaurant, individual restaurant, restaurant chain, restaurant franchise, and also equally as scary, the number of times that restaurateurs have been forced to settle expensively lawsuits brought by the Department of Labor. That top one, by the way, where they resolve a sex discrimination claim, that was for $715,000 is what they settled it for. So let me talk a little bit about the wage and hour laws and the pitfalls that we could run into. And I want to start with the easiest, most simple ones first, I think. We're certainly all aware of the minimum wage. We all pay the minimum wage. We pay more than the minimum wage, right? Because it's hard to recruit people. So I just want you to be aware that in a lot of states, cities, and counties, they change their minimum wage annually. Sometimes, if they feel like there's a lot of catching up to do, they change it every 6 months. So just don't get too comfortable when you know what the minimum wage is. Keep an eye out for that increasing, because they are increasing. In the last few years, the minimum wages have increased faster than ever before. The overtime, this is something else that we all have known since we started working in high school or before. Overtime laws say you have to pay employees time and a half for all the hours that they worked in excess of 40 hours per week. Why do you think, though, that it is the number one reason that restaurateurs are successfully sued for violating the overtime laws? Let me tell you why, and if there's one thing that you take away from today's presentation, this is the most important thing, I think, because it's so easy to lose money when you owe people, when you're found to owe people overtime. No matter how smart you are, no matter how clever you are, there's no scheme to get around paying somebody time and a half for after they've worked 40 hours. And many, many, many people have tried. So many people business owners think, you know what, I think I found a loophole, and let me get this worked out in my restaurant. There is no loophole, and it's very costly. In fact, one of the worst things you can do, because the Department of Labor thinks that by trying to circumvent their overtime laws, you're a sinister person who's trying to not pay your hardworking employees. So please, I've seen employers who think, well, let me lower somebody's hourly rate so that when I pay them overtime, it's really, it's not that much because I lowered their hourly rate to start with. I've seen employers say, they're going to be a manager. They'll work 40 hours for me in the kitchen, and then poof, I'm going to make them the kitchen manager, and then they won't receive any overtime. I've seen employers try to change their work week midstream, so that if somebody's approached 40 hours, they say, all right, you know what, our work week ends today and tomorrow starts a new work week. So please, whatever you do, that overtime laws cannot be beaten. You just got to swallow hard and pay overtime if people are working it. For the hours worked, you already know that employers have to pay employees for any bit of time that they're working, right? They can't be performing work until they've clocked in. But I want to point out also the concept of, if you are controlling what they do with their time, they have to be on the clock. So, for example, a lot of us have policies that say employees must report to work 10 to 15 minutes prior to the start of their shift. And that's fine if we have that policy, but as soon as you say they must report to work 10 or 15 minutes early, you have to have them punch in as soon as they report to work and pay them for that grace period. And maybe that's something you want to do. If you don't, I suggest changing your policy to say we recommend that you arrive 10 to 15 minutes early so that you're ready for the start of your shift. But if you say they must do it, then you must pay them for it. It's the same thing with meal breaks. If you are not paying employees for a 30-minute meal break, and you don't have to pay employees for a 30-minute meal break. If you don't pay for it, though, you can't impose any sort of control, like you can't tell them they have to remain on the premises. You can't tell them they have to sort of keep an eye out on their station in case it gets busy. You have to let them be completely free to do whatever it is they want to do in that meal break. But if they're on the clock, then you can impose some parameters on them. The tip law under wage and hour, these are some of the newest laws that are out there. In fact, it's only been in the last 18 months or so that the Biden administration has finalized and executed a lot of these tip laws. So what are these newest laws? The first one, of course, is this: tipped employees have to retain all the tips that they earn other than mandatory tip pools. There was a lot of exploitation, right? Managers were trying to take some of their tips. Supervisors were feeling like they deserved some tips. Managers wanted to be good guys, so they spread tips around. That we can't do that anymore. That employees have to retain all of their tips unless there's a valid tip pool. If there's a valid tip pool, then you can require employees to pay out tips to positions that are normally tipped, like your bar backs, your runners, your bussers, so they can be tipped out. But other than those positions, the other people cannot be part of a tip pool. Your kitchen staff can't be part of a tip pool. Your hosts and hostesses can't. And again, especially supervisors or managers can't be part of that. If you have a tip pool, you've got to pay out those tips no later than once every pay period at the latest. And the other new law with tip law is a crackdown on that tip credit. And when I say tip credit, I think some people use different terminology, so I want to explain what I'm talking about. Tip credit is when you pay a tipped employee like a server or a bartender much less than what the state's minimum wage is, because you know that they're going to make up the rest of that money in tips. So for example, here in Washington, D.C., our minimum wage is $16.10 an hour, but we only have to pay a minimum cash wage for tipped employees of $5.35 an hour. So that's all on the up and up. As long as the employee makes $10.75 an hour in tips, they're earning minimum wage at least, and everything's cool. And that $10.75 is called the tip credit. But you can only take that tip credit for hours that a tipped employee is doing work that produces tips. If there's ever a time where that employee is not working for tips, like they're in a mandatory staff meeting, or work got really slow, and rather than send them home, you have them do side work for a while. The law is if there's a 30-minute period within any hour that they are not actively earning tips, you can't take a tip credit on them, and you have to pay them minimum wage, the full minimum wage for that hour. So it gets complicated, I know. And then the last wage and hour law that I want to talk about, I saved the most complicated for last, and this is the proper classification of salaried managers. Salaried managers have to pass what the Department of Labor calls an executive exemption test. And I know executive is not the word that we use for our managers. So when you hear executive exemption, think manager exemption test. The only way that you are legally allowed to pay somebody a salary and exempt them from being paid overtime is if their actual job duties pass this Department of Labor test. And the test is made up of 4 parts. And the tricky thing is this: not one of these parts has anything to do with what is their job title, doesn't have anything to do with what is their written job description and what do we think they are doing every day. It's got everything to do with what they actually are doing. So the first 2 parts of this test are easy enough for us to figure out, right? They have to be compensated with a salary of at least $684 per week. That winds up being a little more than $35,000 a year. That's not difficult for us to get there. Also, if you're going to pay them salary, they have to be regularly directing the work of at least 2 full-time employees or more. So you can't have a manager who only has 1 employee, a salaried manager only has 1 employee working under him or her. Now this is where it gets tougher. This employee, if you're going to pay them a salary, they have to have the authority to hire, fire, promote, demote, anything that important. You have to have given them the autonomy and the authority, vest that in them to make those big, important decisions themselves. If they're not the ultimate decision maker, they at least have to be able to strongly influence with their own opinion the ultimate decision maker on the hiring and firing. And finally, their primary duty has to be performing management functions. We used to think of primary duty in terms, and this helps me a lot, in terms of what percentage of their job. And the standard used to be 80%. So if an employee spends 80% of their time working on management functions, then that's a good indicator that you can pay them a salary. And when I say management functions, I mean they're doing the hiring and the firing, they're doing your accounting, they're purchasing, your marketing, all those other things that that a manager does because it needs a much different skill level and is more important to your business than what the hourly employees are doing. If they're working on your strategy, right? They're doing things that the business could not survive without their knowledge. What we have a lot in this industry are managers. We call them managers, we pay them salaries, but it's sort of a gray area because if we think about it, they're probably not spending the vast majority of their time on management functions. We have sous chefs that are better than cooks. They are supervising cooks, they may be training cooks, but they're spending most of their time cooking. We have assistant managers that are great employees, but they are spending their time on the floor, making sure that the servers are doing a good job and intervening if anything goes wrong. So they're not really spending their time on management functions. This is a tricky thing, and so one of the handouts that I have for this presentation is from the Department of Labor that explains this executive exemption test. In regular English, it will help you figure out what does it mean to be primary duty and what does it mean to be managing the enterprise. So if you've got anybody that you're wondering, should they be salaried or not, then you can run them through this test, behind closed doors and figure it out before the Department of Labor gets involved. The last thing I want to point out for wage and hour laws is their record keeping requirements. They don't require us to use time clocks. They don't require us to have time cards. They don't require us to have any sort of method. They just require us to maintain these records and keep them for 2 or 3 years. And I want you to see what these records are, and because here's the pitfall with record keeping requirements. If you've ever had the unfortunate experience of being contacted by the Department of Labor for any reason, they are not going to they're not going to come in and share with you, we've got a complaint, we're looking into this. They're not going to say, we've received a concern, we would like to know about this. The first thing they're going to do is come in and ask for your records. And it's a make or break thing. If you have these records that you've kept and maintained per their laws, they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt that everything's on the up and up. And if there was a mistake made, it was unintentional and can easily be remedied. If you don't have records, that puts you at a deficit immediately with the Department of Labor. And they start to salivate almost, thinking, oh, we've got somebody who either doesn't care that we've got these record keeping laws, or they've got really shoddy pay practices. And either way, they're just going to keep digging and digging and digging when they see this is a company that doesn't keep records. And the last thing to wrap up this section, I want to show you what happens if the Department of Labor finds an employer who is what they consider a bad actor. Clearly, that's none of you. You wouldn't be on this webinar. You wouldn't care about HR compliance if you were looking to skirt Department of Labor laws, but they really go for the jugular and fine people when they think that an owner is falsifying, hiding, or trying to thwart them in any way, not just paying back wages and liquidated damages, but suing that employer personally too. So that is the wage and hour section, and I thought maybe we could pause for questions if there are any questions before we go on.
Oh yes.
Oh yes, there's some questions.
Are there? Okay, good.
Joe, do you want to go first? Go ahead.
You go ahead, Jim.
Okay. It was Linda asked, what information that you've covered so far, what needs to be in employee handbooks? And you recently helped us update our employee handbook template. So can you tell us what the law is regarding what should be in? the employee handbooks?
Thank you. Linda, that's a great question. I love employee handbooks. And yes, I was fortunate enough, honored to help out restaurantowner.com with their employee handbook template. So the short answer is that's what needs to be in an employee handbook. You can go get it from this website. Believe it or not, employee handbooks are not required by law. But this is what I say. They should be considered the employer's handbook, because the handbook is where you get to put all the information that shows that you are compliant. Like we'll be talking about sexual harassment and harassment. The handbook is the greatest place to put your policies in there so that you show your employees and the government, of course, we don't tolerate sexual harassment. Here's our policy. So handbooks are a great way to communicate all of your compliance items in one nice, neat little manual, and also help the employees with a roadmap of what your rules and expectations are, so that should you have to discipline them later, there's no question that you did it fairly because it was in black and white in your handbook.
Danielle, when you talked about the employee handbook, but that plays right to the first statement you made early, that employees think a lot more about your reputation and that you're working for a reputable company when you have that type of organization, right?
Yep, good point. That's right. They're proud when they get an employee handbook. They know that they work for a company that, okay, I can operate within these rules. And also, I don't have to guess what's going on. And also, I see in here that there's a lot of stuff that shows my employer cares about me.
Great. We've had a couple questions, and I'll just ask one of them here. It says, we pay our servers minimum wage. We tip pool with the kitchen and dishwashers. Is this okay since we pay our servers the full minimum wage? And I think people get mixed up that when they use that tip, or at least on a federal level, they use the tip credit. That's a no-no automatically. But if they're paying full minimum wage, what was that ruling in April 30th of 2021? Can you comment on that, please?
Thank you. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. Correct. As long as you pay your servers minimum wage, then they're not losing anything as far as the Department of Labor goes. It's only when you start subtracting from a minimum wage that the Department of Labor thinks, oh, we don't know that they're making up that money anymore. But if you're paying the minimum wage, then kind of everything else for the Department of Labor is gravy. And all you have to worry about is, are your servers happy and content enough with the wages that they're making after they tip out?
Hey, can I follow up on that comment? Just that, because that's been a big discussion on our discussion forum, is that because before that was very unclear before, and then when they had the final ruling, that's when they found out that they could have tip pools that included the back of the house, which was confusing to a lot of people. So thank you for asking that, Lee.
Yes, thank you.
Danielle, Megan asks, how about a 16-year-old who is required to take a 30-minute break every 4 hours? Do they need to be paid? Do they need to be paid for that break? And I'm not sure if that's a federal or a local or state or, yeah.
That would be a state law, but all states have some sort of matrix with, if they're this years old and they've worked this many hours, they need this much break time. But in general, and I don't know of a state that contradicts this, what I'm about to say. In general, nobody needs to be paid for 30-minute breaks. As long as the break is uninterrupted, meaning you aren't calling them back to do something, you're not standing over them like, hurry up, you got to get back to work. As long as they have a full 30 minutes of uninterrupted time, it can be completely off the clock. That's different for rest breaks, which are generally 15 to 20 minutes and are on the clock.
Okay, excellent, thanks. Go ahead, Joe.
Linda asked, does keeping records include having digital records? I would assume this day and age it does, right?
It absolutely does. As long as you can put your hands on it, and you don't destroy it, you're retaining it for the full 2 or 3 years. Yep, digital records are great.
Cecilia asked, and this it goes to show that this topic is confusing for a lot of restaurant operators because can I run my restaurant, just run my restaurant? And she asked, can a manager spend time at the register or kitchen during busy times in the restaurant? This isn't about what they can do in the restaurant. It's about how you pay the, and if you could just elaborate on that, how you pay them and tip pooling and everything else, right?
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Yes, managers, you can have managers do whatever, and you'll want them to jump onto a station if it gets busy during a surge. This is to put it in perspective. This is what would happen if the Department of Labor came in and had a complaint that that manager wasn't really a manager. They'd pull that manager aside without you. You wouldn't be allowed to be there, and say, "What do you do every day?" And if that manager said, well, I'm on the cash register between 11:30 and 2 p.m., then that's a problem. But if the manager legitimately says, like, sometimes we get super busy and I jump on the cash for a 30-minute period during lunch, that should be okay.
And that was probably stemmed from trying to understand and not realize what you said earlier. A salaried manager doesn't mean they're exempt from overtime, right?
Right, that's right.
I mean, that's the bottom line, right? Okay.
Right, that's right. And it's super confusing because we use the word salaried interchangeably with exempt, and then you throw the word executive in there and it does get very confusing.
Oh,
but
goodness, yes.
Here's a question from Rick. He says, what if a manager was in a salary position from a previous ownership, I guess, of the restaurant, but they do not meet the criteria that you just mentioned?
Yeah, that happens. You've got two options. It's your liability now, right? So you've got two options. One option, and this is always an option with everything, is you roll the dice and you risk that everything will be okay if you kept it status quo. Because HR compliance is all about risk, right? I don't like it, but other people have a different tolerance. The other thing you can do so as to not alarm him or her into thinking that he might be owed back overtime is I like having these fresh starts and saying, you know what, we reviewed your job description and your job, and you know what, we think we're going to change your classification from salary to hourly. No, like, oh, we made a mistake, this shouldn't have been done. Just say we reviewed it and we think we're going to switch it. It gets problematic if that switches somebody's benefits when you move them from salary to hourly, but otherwise it kind of puts a nice little line in the sand of going forward, we're going to pay him correctly.
Danielle, would you like us to resume some of these questions at the end of the question and answer so you can move on to some other things, or do you want us to ask more?
Yeah, I say, in case there are people who are here for the EEO questions, let me move on to the equal employment opportunity stuff, and then we'll catch up at the end, please.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right, thank you. Great questions.
Yes, they are.
Oh, very good questions.
So this is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This is a different division of the Department of Labor. All the states have the same, their same version of an EEOC. And you probably recognize their statement because it's been around in one shape or form since 1964. It's that applicants, employees, and former employees are protected from discrimination based on these protected characteristics of race, color, religion, sex, national origin. Well, you can read it, but what I want to point out is this is always evolving, right? And it's only been in the last 5 years, actually, it's only been in the last 5 years that the sex part has grown to include pregnancy, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And it's only been in the last 10 years that genetic information's made this list. And age discrimination has always been 40 or older, but now the EEOC wants to make sure we know that it's 40 or older. So they really are fine-tuning and adding to the list of protected classes. If you have 15 or more employees, then these laws pertain to you. In many states, though, all you need are like 1 to 5 employees, and the state laws will pertain to you. And they apply to everything, not just who you hire and who you fire, but who you promote, who you give benefits to, who you train. Everything are all these employment actions are what's covered under the EEOC laws. And here are the pitfalls, though I want to start off by saying the restaurant owners, these aren't pitfalls for you. You guys know this. It's more likely if somebody's going to run afoul of the EEOC laws, it's going to be when your back is turned and another manager who may not be aware of this is allowing discrimination or harassment to go on at your store. Discrimination, none of us intentionally discriminate, but it is very easy to unintentionally discriminate because of somebody's protected characteristic. And the reason is because our common sense gets in the way of not discriminating, if that makes sense. For example, we've got very physical jobs that we're hiring for, right? There's only one person maybe in your entire restaurant who gets to sit down and have a sedentary job, and everybody else is lifting and carrying and pushing. And sometimes our common sense, we will look at someone who is older or pregnant or a tiny female or disabled, and we will think to ourselves, there's no way they can do this job. And but that turns out to be unintentional discrimination. It's the same thing when we have kitchens that are working really well. It's all one race, right? We have a kitchen full of Hispanic employees, and they work so harmoniously. It's like an orchestra. And then we start thinking, well, I don't want to mess with that, so I'm not going to hire anything but Hispanic employees to work in my kitchen. So that's where inadvertent discrimination comes in, and it is just as illegal as intentional discrimination. Harassment, of course, is any kind of unwelcome conduct that's based on somebody's protected characteristic. And there are things that are harassment, but not illegal harassment. If you're making jokes or insulting people once in a while, mocking people, calling people names, once in a while is harassment, but it becomes downright illegal harassment when either it just doesn't stop, there's no break in between, or if there's just one circumstance, one really bad event that is enough to shock and awe everybody, or if somebody complains about it and nothing's done about it, that's when it becomes illegal. And of course, sexual harassment we're familiar with when a supervisor especially is using his or her authority to request sexual favors or have other harassment that's of a sexual nature. Again, we don't do this, but when we are not at our restaurants, if we haven't hired mature people to be in charge when we're not there, that's when we run into issues. And I want to show you this slide because the Guy Fieri's of the world get all of the press about the sexual harassment stuff, but the Department of Labor goes right after small individual restaurants and franchisees if they find that there's harassment of any kind. And you can see here the numbers that it takes to settle these. Almost every single case, not just these, but going back farther, almost every single case was one manager who did the wrong thing, and then a general manager didn't take action when they found out that when they received a complaint that a manager was harassing or discriminating. So that's for you to know that it's not you that's going to mess this up, but make sure your managers are on board. So you ask, am I liable if there's harassment going on in my restaurant and I don't know about it? Almost always, yes, you are liable. If it results in a negative employment action, you're definitely liable. You're liable for harassment or discrimination if it was going on and you should have known about it. Like if you were paying attention, you are listening to people, you would have known. The only way you can avoid or mitigate your own liability, and this is key, this goes back to the question about the handbook, is if number one, you have a written procedure that says that you don't tolerate harassment and here is how to complain about it, and you give a couple of different options like go to this manager or go to this manager. And if the employee failed to use that procedure to make a complaint, that will get you off the hook. And that does happen a lot of times. Employees get mad and they quit because they don't really like their job anyway, and then they make a complaint about harassment, but you didn't know about it and they never bothered telling you. So you can be off the hook that way. Please watch out for retaliation. You'll always be liable for retaliation, and it is the second largest lawsuit from the EEOC is retaliation suits. It's when you punish a job applicant or an employee because they did make a complaint. And it's easy for us to do because we kind of take it personally. We get upset. We think, well, this person isn't a team player, and so I'm going to cut their hours, or I'm going to be extra scrutinizing their attendance, whereas I don't scrutinize other people's attendance. So retaliation is an easy trap to get into. It doesn't mean that people are exempt from being written up or being terminated, but you just have to be extra careful that you're doing it for all documented factual reasons, and you're treating them the same way that you treat people who did not make a complaint about harassment or discrimination. How you get on the Department of Labor's radar, no matter how many resources they've added, they don't have enough resources to proactively go out and try to find some wrongdoing in the industry. It always starts with a complaint to them. Usually it's either somebody that you didn't hire or somebody that you fired, because they think, well, it's not, I'm feeling rejected, but it's not me. It must be my race, my sexual identity, my disability, whatever. So they will go to the Department of Labor. Sometimes it's current employees that have tried to use your complaint procedure, but nothing's changed, so they contact the Department of Labor. And sometimes, because we have young employees, sometimes it's their parents that contact the Department of Labor. But whatever it is, they call them. They've got a 1-800 number that's open 24/7. You can walk into an office and meet with a claims examiner. They tell their story. And then if the Department of Labor thinks there's a little smoke there, they're going to contact you with a notification or a charge or a letter of investigation. If you get contacted by the Department of Labor, your instinct is going to be to say, I have nothing to hide. Come on in and I'll give you everything. I'll tell you anything. What do you want to know? I've got nothing to hide. Don't do that. Remember at the beginning of this presentation when I said that they were gleefully saying 9,000 restaurants and we found violations in almost every single one. They will find a violation in your restaurant too. So don't invite them in and don't think that you should be an open book. If you get contacted, call your human resources consultant or an employment attorney, and they're going to advise you how to respond, but you'll probably be responding with just like the exact documents they're looking for, no more, no less, and you aren't going to want them to come into your restaurant to see them either. What can you do? We spent today making you generally aware of the wage and hour and equal opportunity laws. You'll train your supervisors on these too, including making sure they're mature enough to not have this banter in the restaurant when you're not around. And you should be building an HR foundation that establishes your intent to comply with all these laws. An HR foundation, and I have a handout that goes into more detail about what an HR foundation looks like, but you'll want job ads and applications that have your equal opportunity statements, job descriptions that talk about the physical requirements of jobs, the handbook and the policies, the notices, the performance evaluations. You'll want to have an employee hotline possibly so that you know employees can make a complaint to somebody and it's not going to get lost in the cracks or fall on deaf ears. The best thing about these HR foundations is restaurantowner.com has done it for you. If you just go to their resource library and look for all of their resources, you can download a whole bunch of HR foundation that you'll need. And just a lot of times you just swap out your logo and put in your company name and there, it's done, easy breezy. And they've also got this great employment toolkit too to help you with other resources with these things. All right, woo! I sped through that last part so we could get to some questions.
Okay, great. Danielle, we'll go ahead and get to as many questions as we can. If we have any that we aren't able to get to, I hate to put you on the spot, but could we get with you and maybe get short responses and then put that on the recorded webinar page?
I would love to.
Awesome. Okay.
I love talking about this all day, every day.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
You're going to get the opportunity because there's a lot of questions.
Oh, great. I'm free tomorrow.
Okay, all right. Joe, go ahead. Do you have one teed up?
Hold on just a second. Just let's see here. Yes. There was a question about, I wanted to find the one. There's questions about should a manager or banquet managers be put on salary or hourly? And I think giving them a fixed number of hours is not an issue, right? It's when they work more hours and that becomes an issue. So maybe if you address that, that would alleviate some of the other questions we had about that.
Okay. Everything is going to be based on that executive exemption test I was talking about, where you want to pull that hand out and be honest with yourself about what is my banquet manager doing? Are they selling banquets? Are they doing all the work that it takes to manage? Are they coordinating the menus? Or are they really just supervising a banquet and we're calling them a manager? So first use that test to be honest with yourself and think about whether they should be hourly or salary. Regardless of how many hours they work, the right thing to do is to, if they are supposed to be hourly, change them to hourly. And the reason is, should they become disgruntled, they can always go to the Department of Labor and say, I worked 50, 60 hours a week and I never got paid overtime. And even if you know the truth is they never worked 50 or 60 hours a week, you aren't keeping track because you didn't think you would need to, and the Department of Labor is going to take their word for it. So if you do that exemption test and you find they shouldn't be paid a salary, we should be paying them by the hour, pay them by the hour and just watch their hours accordingly.
Documenting their hours worked is the most important thing there is when there's any question about it, right? Okay.
Right. Because the employees are, right? They keep a little notebook and they write down their hours, and those are, the Department of Labor loves employee records. When they say how many hours they work, they're just as good as gold. So we should be doing it too.
Okay. Jim?
Yeah, Rosalinda has a question here. She says, you mentioned time cards are not required. If a restaurant has a point of sale, which does records the overtime, but what about if time cards are manually done? I thought Department of Labor does require time cards.
They require that you keep records of time, and the POS systems do a great job of that.
Okay.
But if you don't have a POS system, I think time cards themselves aren't required, but it can literally be a piece of paper where you have an employee sign in. I started at this time, I left at this time. It's not a time card per se, but it's a record, and that's just as good.
Mhm. Okay.
Leslie has a question regarding drugs. Could you address how to deal with drug issues? My cafe is in a very rural area, and I had an employee last year who was using drugs, but I didn't see her do it. I laid her off. I laid her off. Business was quiet at the time, but did I do anything wrong?
If you laid her off because business was quiet, and especially she was either the most recent one hired, or she had documented bad performance in writing, and so you chose her to lay her off. If you laid her off for that reason, not because of a drug test suspicion, you did perfect.
Okay.
If you laid her off because of a drug test suspicion, like you really wanted to fire, or drug suspicion, you really wanted to fire her, but you didn't think you had enough, so you laid her off. What I recommend for those drugs, because it's tough in our industry, is forget about are you on drugs and start thinking of how does your performance look. If you have somebody whose performance has turned rotten, or their behavior has turned rotten, and you suspect it's because there's drugs or alcohol, you could send them for a drug test. But if you're in a rural area, my advice is you just focus on how did that manifest itself to poor performance, and then discipline somebody that way, all the way up to termination, if that's what it comes down to.
Okay,
Right.
good. Joe, go ahead.
Danielle, Nellie asked a good one. It says, how do we keep records of paid breaks if they're not required to clock out for breaks?
You don't have to. If you're paying them, you don't have to keep records of them. Now,
Okay.
some states have like required rest breaks, but I don't think that they require to actually see when did you take a paid rest break. They just, worst case scenario, an employee is going to say, I never got my rest breaks, and they're going to ask you if you gave them rest breaks. That's all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I have seen some POS systems that they actually have a rest break log where they clock out and clock back in, but they're still getting paid for the entire time. So,
anyway, that's great.
And that may be, one solution. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
That's excellent.
Jim, I know we're top of the hour, but you might have another one.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, why don't I ask one more question, Joe? You ask one more. We want to respect everybody's time, okay? And Danielle, you graciously said you're going to go ahead and help us get responses to people. We'll put that on the recorded webinar page tomorrow, so you will have your questions answered. I've got a question here from Benjamin. Can an employee work multiple positions at different pay rates, like a bartender during lunch, and then manage during dinner at different wages?
Ooh, before you said manage during dinner, I was going to say absolutely. It gets tricky with if you're doing that tip credit thing to figure out when do you take it and when don't you. But yes, you can do that. Okay. For a manager, if your intention is to switch them to a salaried, non-exempt, a salaried exempt from overtime position for some of the week, I wouldn't do it. It looks like you are trying very hard to skirt your obligation to pay a bartender for additional hourly employees, hourly non-exempt hours worked. But if you want to pay them a different rate in a different position, hourly rate, knowing that they will earn overtime on what's called a blended rate, and I can explain that in my answers tomorrow, absolutely, you can have them work multiple rates, multiple positions. Just be prepared to pay them overtime.
Gotcha. Okay.
We've had several questions centered around managers, obviously, and whether they can take tips. And the one question is, can a manager take and receive tips? And the general answer is yes, but right?
That's right.
No tip pooling, no sharing, no.
Right. This is how the Department of Labor explains it. If a manager has done something his or herself that earned a tip, then he or she can keep that tip. So not like, oh, I gave great service and I checked on tables. That isn't enough. But say somebody fell in the parking lot and a manager went and called 911, got water, waited till the ambulance came. That manager's above and beyond. It was only the manager that performed that service, and they gave a tip because of that service. The manager can keep a tip for that. That's an extreme example, but that's when managers can keep tips, when it's something that they did, not just part of normal service.
Would it be fair to say in general that managers cannot take, I mean, the easiest litmus test was you can't share or take any portion of employees' tips, no matter how that is. If it's a pool, there's no working around that. You just can't do it, right?
That is absolutely ideal. Not only will it always be legal, but the manager will look like a hero to the employees when he turns tips over.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Well, Danielle, this has been fabulous. You did an outstanding job. We've already started getting compliments on your presentation, the information that you covered. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad. I hope it was helpful.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody for hanging in there with us. You know, almost everybody has been here for over an hour. And again, the recorded version, if you have anybody else in your organization that wants, that would benefit from seeing this, you'll get an email tomorrow afternoon. And Joe, do you have any final thoughts?
Just one comment that came in said, I would have attended this webinar if it was 3 hours long. So, okay.
I want to be friends.
All righty.
That's so
Danielle, thank you again, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.